Hello everyone, thanks for your responses to the first video. I seem to see a consensus there that everybody feels that these videos are helping, which is good. Hope you're bearing up under the general conditions that we're working in. So this is just a short video to tidy up a few things relating to Hasty and of course the questions raised in relation to Hasty, which I'm glad to say everyone answered more or less correctly. So just a couple of points of, shall we say, advice that I would give. I won't go through the questions since you all seem to deal with them very expertly, but in relation to question one, I think there was one person missed the point, which was the spatialization of time that Ligeti talks about. So the key word there, if you didn't have this, was spatialization, but everybody picked up that Ligeti's recognition of this kind of thinking in prior composers post-tonally was clearly epitomized by, for him at least, Webern, and pretty much for the whole post-war high modernist generation. But spatialization and Webern would have completed question one. Question 7, yes, you all spotted that this was an octatonic collection, but the correct octatonic was 1, 2. So the correct octatonic was collection 1, 2, not 0, 1. So it was just missing, as I think Charles pointed out, B flat would complete a full octatonic 1, 2 at that point. Okay, so to move on to a slightly later phase in the Hasty article, Yi asked if I could at least make some kind of clarification in relation to the material around pages 70 and 71. So I'll do that here. Hopefully everyone will find it useful. What I'm going to do is release a longer video, hopefully today, maybe tomorrow, that would be Friday, with some questions relating to the next article by Elegant and McLean. So that will come either later today, Thursday, or early tomorrow, Friday. So let's just zero in on pages 70 to 71 of Hasty. And these questions related to the material where he talks about section C. So Hasty is talking about section C. I think part of the problem is what we don't get is the actual musical score. So we have to take Hasty's recommendations on trust that he is correct, because he does not relate them to the score. In example 12, we get a 2-line reduction of the score. And he says, well, what I'm looking at here is the way that the A2 section, which we have covered, terminates with Z. We talked about the terminations that occur over that sort of initial 22 measure phase. That was part of the first video. And what he lines up here is the way that this new section C begins with a kind of reiterated interval class 2 pattern, which is how Z also moved, whereas that had D6 to E6. You can see that at the bottom of example 12, reiterating that sort of whole step toggle, that sort of fluctuation, and then terminated with set class 0, 2, 3, 5, that is 410. When it comes back in C, it's clearly transposed, but there is still an IC2 interval class 2 fluctuation now between A flat 5 and G flat 5 to start off. And then following that, we get, again, an iteration of set class 410, 0, 2, 3, 5. So I think that's where he sees a parallel. Now he says that section C partly also mediates between sections A and B. He says that this happens in terms of pulse, but we don't get a lot of detail on that. So I think we have to again trust him. But he says that it's also true that there's a kind of harmonic recall. Well, it's firstly in the case of that tetrachord 410, and then also set class 411. But the metrical cue we get to go with that, I think, is that we have a kind of acceleration now with a quarter note, as you can see from the tempo change as the main counting unit at the speed of quarter note equals 108. So he thinks that's some kind of mediation between sections A and B, both metrically, but also crucially harmonically in terms of the tetrachord types. Now, Yi also asked about what is Cx and Cy. So he says that they partly relate back to example 5 on page 66. So you can see, if you go back to page 66, example 5, where there's a Q forwards to the next example. That next example appears on page 71, which is example 13. So here, what Hasty does is pick out the salient pitch classes for this new section C, which he regards as being broken up into, rather like the opening section, 2 units, an X and a Y. An X and a Y. So here, instead of an A section, which is broken down into an X1, X2, here we have it a CX and a CY, which was the designation he gave to the termination at the beginning, which was kind of XX and then a Y, and then we had a section which ended with a Z, so he made that connection earlier on. So he's got the same idea in mind. Again, the problem I think comes because what we don't have is the actual score to refer to be able to see how this pattern is built up. So again, we have to take this on trust that these are the salient pitch classes he's thinking about. So that long linear descent is not necessarily projected in terms of a kind of continuous stream. Instead, we have to assume that that's possibly an ideal reconstruction. But what it does show is that Stravinsky is clearly thinking in terms of consistent harmonic technique, which gradually unfolds. So that example 14 then shows how the C units actually relate back to the A units in terms of the projections of this particular set class 410, which is plainly octatonic. So I hope you can see that in terms of the A section which we discussed, it's kind of F natural 6 is the focal tone. Here in C, the new focal tone at the very beginning is C sharp 6. And he says, yeah, you can see that projected both at the beginning and then it's also there in the falling point or the sort of falling sequence in the next measure. Inside the 410, you get D natural 5, C sharp 5, and then B natural 4. So that's on example 13. What else does he speak about? So he says that all of these referential pitch classes, if you look at the bigger picture, tend to work not in terms of half steps, but ultimately whole steps. So he says in terms of A and B, what you tend to find is that there's an upper neighbour, which is E, he says, falls to D in section A. In section B, the focal tone, predominant focal tone is F, and that is approached from beneath. That is via E flat. So E flat rises to F with interval class 2, E falls to D with interval class 2. In CX, the pattern is symmetrical. So we have a B flat notionally falling to A flat and G flat rising to A flat. So if you look at the beginning of example 13, so that's the first designated measure, you can see that B flat ends that 410, 411 sequence. So that's B flat 5 falls to A flat 5, but beneath that A flat 5, we also have G flat 5. So what he's looking at there is those interval class 2s, in this particular case, surrounding an A flat, which is the focal tone. And if we look at those focal tones, that would be D, F, and A flat. So you can almost see, if we had a B natural there, that there would be a sort of diminished seventh, set class number 428, set class 0369. Again, it would be an octatonic expression of salience. So the last thing, which I hope irons this out, is if we turn to page 71, he talks about the revision of the score Stravinsky made when he came to America in 1947. He says that this interval class 2 logic is actually amplified there, where Stravinsky takes the upper line and adds some parallel motion. You can see that in example 15. That you have, in effect, what Stravinsky has done is to create two simultaneities, which are set class 016s, 3-5 and 3-5, adding up to 6Z41 as a big hexachord, and then almost immediately a T5 transposition of that same set class, again split up into 2 3-5 trichords. Of course, both of those would be octatonic. And that just amplifies this sense that interval class 2 is a particularly important way of just picking out focal tones locally. He talked about interval class 3s initially as the spans between those focal tones. We talked about the focal tones, or I did just in this video now, D, F, and A flat, all separated by interval class 3, but the approaches to those particular focal tones are by interval class 2. So I hope that makes sense for everyone of the X and the Y. The difficulty is that we don't get the music examples to back this up. As I say, we just have to look at Hasty's examples and try to make sense of things in this way by just reading his text. All right, I'm going to sign off. This is already quite a long video, so I'm going to pause now, and I will be back through with hopefully half, of Elegant and McLean, and with some questions, and we'll work to the same pattern. So expect to see that perhaps today, Thursday, if not early tomorrow, Friday. All right, so good luck everyone, and I will be in touch again soon. Bye for now.